The morning of January 29th, 1944, dawned pale and brittle over a snow-covered field outside Wismar, northern Germany. The Luftwaffe ground crewmen of Erprobungstelle Rechlin, the secret testing command of the Reich's air ministry, stood in the biting wind, staring at something that made no sense. Before them rested a foreign aircraft, its aluminum skin dulled by frost and mud from an emergency landing. Its nose was long and purposeful, the canopy streamlined almost flush with the fuselage. The code letters, faintly stenciled on the flank QPJ, still bore the traces of invasion stripes hastily painted over. It was an American fighter, but not one any of them had ever seen up close. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Allied pilot, captured alive and now being led away under guard, had belly landed his crippled machine after flak shattered his cooling system near Bremen. Miraculously, he had survived. The machine had not burned. The guards did not yet know it, but the wreck lying half buried in snow would soon shake the German fighter establishment to its core. For the first time, the Luftwaffe possessed an intact example of the aircraft that had begun to haunt their radio reports since the previous December, a new type called the Mustang. Technicians crowded around, prying open the engine cowling, muttering in disbelief at the unfamiliar lines of the power plant within. It was a British-designed Merlin engine, but something about it looked distinctly American: tidier wiring, cleaner castings, standardized fittings. The label on the block read Packard Motor Company, Detroit, Michigan. The senior test engineer, Hauptmann Hans Müller, made a quiet note in his logbook that morning. Enemy single-seater fighter, captured intact, appears of mixed Anglo-American origin, extraordinary, craftsmanship, will dispatch to Rechlin for full evaluation. He could not know that within weeks, his technical report, dry, clinical, precise, would circulate among the Reich top aeronautical minds and spark a quiet panic. For nearly 5 years, German aviation had led the world. Their Messerschmitts and Fokker-Wulfs had conquered the skies over Poland, France, and the Soviet steppe. They had believed, with reason, that German science and engineering outpaced all rivals. Yet the machine sitting before them defied the foundations of that belief. It was faster, lighter, and somehow impossibly capable of flying to Berlin and back from England. To understand why this aircraft caused such disquiet, one must first understand the fortress of conviction in which the Luftwaffe's fighter arm had lived since the early years of the war. In 1939, the Reich's aviation industry stood as the most advanced on Earth. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, with its sleek monoplane design and all-metal construction, symbolized modernity itself. Its Daimler-Benz inverted V12 engine was a masterpiece of precision machining, capable of steady power at high altitude and negative G maneuvers that no British Merlin could match in those years. By 1940, when the Battle of Britain began, the German fighter corps believed themselves heirs to a technical aristocracy. They had numbers to prove it: faster climb rates, roll rates, and engine reliability than the early Spitfire Mark I. Even as the Luftwaffe ultimately failed to bring Britain to its knees, the myth of German engineering superiority survived unshaken. Inside Germany, this conviction was not merely patriotic pride, it was doctrine. In the technical universities at Göttingen and Braunschweig, professors lectured that aerodynamics was a distinctly German science, descended from the work of Ludwig Prandtl and the Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes. When propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels spoke of the spirit of German technology, it was not idle rhetoric. To the men of the fighter command, technological destiny was as real as gravity. Even by 1943, with the Allies mass-producing aircraft at a rate that dwarfed German factories, Luftwaffe officers comforted themselves that quality would triumph over quantity. Their phrase was technische Überlegenheit, technical superiority. But behind the scenes, that superiority was already eroding. By the summer of 1943, the Allies had begun fielding machines that hinted at a new kind of air war, an industrial one. The British were rolling out successive Spitfire marks every few months, each subtly improved. The Americans, still derided as clumsy amateurs by many in Berlin, were demonstrating an unnerving ability to mass-produce precision machines that worked reliably day after day. When German pilots first encountered the long-nosed fighter, later identified as the P-51 Mustang in the winter of 1943, they assumed it was another short-range Allied design. Reports described it as fast at medium altitude but lacking endurance. No one imagined it could escort bombers deep into Germany. That illusion shattered in February 1944, during the week the Allies called Big Week. For the first time, American fighters accompanied bombers all the way to Leipzig, Augsburg, and Regensburg and back. Radio traffic crackled with disbelief as formations of silver fighters appeared over targets once considered safe from escort interference. Veteran German aces like Major Walter Dahl and Georg Peter Eder, accustomed to attacking unescorted bomber streams, found themselves outclimbed and outturned by the newcomers. Reports filtered upward through command channels, often disbelieved by higher headquarters. Enemy single-engine fighters encountered over central Germany. Type unknown. High speed above 7,000 meters. Unusual range. Adolf Galland, the inspector of fighters, noted in his March 1944 diary that intelligence could not identify this new type with certainty. Some thought it a modified Spitfire. Others suspected a twin-engine design operating on one engine. Then came the capture at Wismar. The wreck arrived at Rechlin a week later on a flatbed rail car under tarpaulin cover. The test center, nestled in the forests of Mecklenburg, was Germany's equivalent of the Allied Wright Field, where every new aircraft was dissected, measured, and flown. When the tarpaulin was removed, observers gathered silently around the strange machine. Its skin panels were smoother than any German aircraft flush riveted to a degree rarely seen in wartime production. The wing had an unfamiliar geometry, subtly thicker near the root, but tapering with mathematical precision. Oberingenieur Karl Bauer, chief test pilot of the Luftwaffe's experimental command, ran his hand along the leading edge and frowned. "It feels wrong," he said softly. "There is almost no step, no turbulence." What Bauer was touching was the Mustang's laminar flow wing, a design principle so advanced that few German aerodynamicists had believed it practical. Whereas conventional wings generated turbulent flow beginning at roughly 30% of chord, the Mustangs maintained smooth flow beyond 60%. The result was dramatically lower drag and therefore higher range and speed. Inside the fuselage, the Germans found evidence of a manufacturing philosophy utterly foreign to their system. Components were standardized, easily removable, clearly labeled in English for maintenance. The radio set, an SCR 522, had crystal-controlled channels for clarity. The oxygen regulator, neat and compact, could be operated with gloved hands. Even the cockpit ergonomics stunned the test team. In the Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf cockpits, instruments were scattered where space allowed, products of incremental design. In the Mustang, every dial was placed logically, flight instruments clustered before the pilot, engine gauges grouped by system. "Everything here is built for production and operation, not prestige," one engineer observed. When technicians finally hoisted the Merlin engine from its mounts, they found the key to the mystery. It was indeed a Rolls-Royce design, the V12, 60-degree, liquid-cooled Merlin, but this one bore Packard's manufacturing stamp. The Americans had taken the British design and reproduced it with industrial consistency unthinkable in German conditions. Each cylinder head was interchangeable, each nut and fitting standardized. Where German engines required hand-matching of parts by skilled craftsmen, the Packard Merlin could be built by the thousand with minimal adjustment. The realization struck hard. German engineers prided themselves on artisanal perfection. Yet here was a machine that achieved excellence through repetition. Oberstleutnant Hermann Schmidt, the Air Ministry's liaison to Messerschmitt, summarized the paradox in a confidential memorandum dated February 10, 1944. "This aircraft represents an industrial rather than an artisanal victory. Its performance exceeds our best fighters, not because of exotic materials or secret fuels, but because every surface and junction is optimized for production tolerances beyond our capability under current conditions. The report circulated quietly to Berlin, where it reached Gallen's staff. Though the Reich was already investing vast resources into the jet-powered Me-262, the captured Mustang raised uncomfortable questions. If the Allies could field such an efficient piston fighter, how could Germany hope to regain the skies before jets were ready? To appreciate how revolutionary the Mustang seemed to German eyes, one must consider the technological stagnation that beset their own fighter programs by late 1943. The Bf-109, despite continual upgrades, was essentially a 1935 design. Its narrow undercarriage and cramped cockpit had been acceptable in the Spanish Civil War, but were liabilities by 1944. The W-190, though more modern, sacrificed high-altitude performance for ruggedness and firepower. Efforts to produce true successors such as the Ta-152 and the Heinkel He-112 had stalled amid bureaucratic infighting and Hitler's personal interventions. Engineers complained that specifications changed weekly, that priority shifted from interceptor to bomber to jet and back again. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Meanwhile, Allied production lines in Britain and America operated with mechanical discipline. North American aviation, where the Mustang was built, used assembly line techniques refined from automobile manufacturing. In the time it took Germany to hand-fit one Me-262 jet, the Americans could finish a dozen P-51s. When German engineers at Rechlin ran the captured Mustang through wind tunnel tests, the data stunned them. At 30,000 feet, its top speed approached 440 miles per hour, faster than any German propeller-driven fighter except the high-altitude 4190D still in prototype. More astonishing was its range, with external drop tanks, over 800 miles. That figure contradicted every assumption underpinning German air defense strategy. The Reich's fighter network had been organized around the belief that Allied escorts could not reach central Germany. Now, those calculations were worthless. The Mustang had rewritten the geometry of the air war. Within weeks of the tests, the captured aircraft, repainted with Balkan Kreuz markings, was flown by Rechlin test pilot Hans-Werner Lerche under the code T9+CK. His flight report, dated March 2, 1944, survives in post-war archives. Takeoff characteristics excellent, engine response immediate and smooth. Handling qualities superior to both Bf-109G and FW-190A at medium and high altitude. Stall benign. Visibility unmatched. Elevator authority exceptional. The aircraft inspires confidence. One feels as though the machine anticipates control inputs. Lerche concluded his report with a remark that would later echo through Allied intelligence summaries recovered after the war. We could not have built this aircraft. It was not an admission of incompetence, but of industrial reality. Germany's fragmented aircraft industry, divided among Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, Heinkel, Arado, and dozens of subcontractors, lacked the integrated supply chain that made such a design feasible. Aluminum shortages, labor disorganization, and constant Allied bombing further crippled any hope of producing something so refined. When the Rechlin findings reached Albert Speer's Ministry of Armaments, the response was grim. A handwritten note in the margin of the summary, believed to be Speer's own, reads, "Even if we could copy it, we could not build it in quantity." By early spring 1944, Luftwaffe Command knew what the test data meant. The Mustang was not just another fighter, it was a weapon of attrition warfare, one that combined industrial scale with tactical reach. Every Bf-109 shot down over Germany would be replaced by another Allied fighter before the week was out. Every German loss represented irreplaceable skill, every Allied loss a statistic. The equation had reversed. For the pilots still flying daily defense sorties, these technical revelations filtered down as whispers that the Americans had built a fighter that could fly forever, that it climbed like a rocket, that it outran the Focke-Wulf. Some dismissed the talk as defeatism. Others had already seen the truth through gun sights. Oberfeldwebel Heinz Noak of Jagdgeschwader 55 recorded in his diary after an engagement near Münster on March 12, 1944. The new American fighter climbs past us as though we are standing still. I dive to escape. He follows easily. The Merlin engine wails higher and higher, and suddenly he is above me, turning. There is no safety anymore. In squadron-ready rooms across Western Germany, confidence began to erode. The familiar sound of Merlin engines, once heard only over occupied France, now echoed over Hanover and Berlin. Yet for many Luftwaffe officers, the captured Mustang at Rechlin represented more than a technological challenge. It symbolized a deeper defeat. The realization that Germany's claim to scientific and industrial mastery had been overtaken. The irony was bitter. The nation that had pioneered modern aerodynamics was now being out-engineered by the very industrial democracy it had mocked as crude and materialistic. In the quiet corridors of Rechlin, where engineers studied the Mustang's blueprints and performance charts, some began to admit what no propaganda could hide. Germany had lost not only the battle for the skies, but the battle for the modern age itself. The first flight of the captured Mustang at Rechlin took place under a brittle blue sky on March 8, 1944. The airfield, ringed by pine forests, was still rimed with snow. Mechanics wheeled the silver aircraft from its hangar, now bearing the black cross of the Luftwaffe on its wings. Test pilot Hans-Werner Lerch climbed into the cockpit, adjusted the British-style Sutton harness, and settled his gloved hands on the unfamiliar control column. Observers from the Reich Luftfahrtministerium Air Ministry stood beside the runway with notebooks ready. Among them was Dr. Otto Baerbohm, one of Germany's leading aerodynamicists. He had designed wing profiles for Messerschmitt's Me-262 jet. Yet, as he watched Lerche taxi the captured machine to the runway, he felt, as he later wrote in his post-war memoir, a small unease that this foreign aircraft seemed to fit its pilot like a well-tailored uniform. At 10:07 hours, Lerche pushed the throttle forward. The Merlin engine roared, its 12 cylinders firing with liquid smoothness. The aircraft accelerated rapidly, tail lifting almost at once. Within 600 meters, it was airborne. Takeoff effortless, Lerche recorded in his flight notes. No torque swing as in 4190, stability excellent. He climbed steadily, leveling off at 5,000 meters. The airspeed indicator showed 420 miles per hour, already beyond the top speed of most German fighters at that height. He tested roll rate, noting the aircraft's responsiveness. When he banked left, the Mustang's wing bit into the air cleanly, without the sluggishness familiar in the heavier Fokker-Wulf. At 10,000 meters over 30,000 feet, the Packard Merlin still pulled strongly. Lerche throttled back, feeling the steady hum through the seat. At this altitude, he wrote, the engine retains full power. The cooling system shows remarkable efficiency. Control harmony is perfect. This aircraft has no vices. When he landed 40 minutes later, his report astonished the observers. Handling is superior in every regime, he said simply. I could not catch it in a dive with any of our current types. It is the best single-seater I have flown. That verdict carried weight. Lerche had test-flown nearly every German aircraft from the pre-war Heinkel, He-112, to the jet-powered Me-262. His quiet authority left no room for bluster. The Rechlin engineers spent the following weeks dissecting every component. They tested the propeller, a 4-bladed Hamilton standard on the dynamometer, and found its efficiency curve astonishingly flat, across a wide speed range. German propellers, optimized for narrow conditions, lost thrust at high altitude. This one did not. They measured the wing's drag coefficient using wind tunnel models and confirmed what theory had suggested. At high speed, the Mustang generated almost 30% less drag than a comparable Bf-109. They tested the drop tanks, thin-walled aluminum cylinders of American manufacture, and found their quick-release mechanism simple, reliable, and foolproof. In German fighters, external tanks often failed to jettison cleanly, sometimes costing pilots their lives. Even the smallest details carried lessons. The Mustang's canopy, a frameless bubble introduced on later variants, offered near-total visibility. German test reports noted this enviously. Field of view, exemplary. In our aircraft, restricted visibility to rear continues to endanger pilots. The more the engineers studied, the more their respect deepened and their anxiety grew. By April 1944, news of the captured Mustang's performance had spread quietly through technical circles. At the Messerschmitt factory in Augsburg, engineers debated how to respond. Some proposed fitting the Bf-109 with a more powerful Daimler-Benz DB605L engine and larger supercharger to match the Mustang's high-altitude power. Others argued that only the forthcoming TAR-152, a high-altitude variant of the Fokker-Wulf, could compete. But resources were scarce, and time scarcer. Since the previous autumn, Allied bombers escorted by Mustangs had begun striking deep into the Reich's industrial heart. Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Kassel and Augsburg burned. The Rechlin test center itself came under attack in May. Engineers often had to halt wind tunnel tests to take cover in trenches. The Luftwaffe's defensive system, once the pride of Germany, was unraveling. The radar stations of the Kammhuber line, designed to coordinate night fighter interceptions, were blinded by electronic jamming. Fuel supplies dwindled. The skies over Western Germany became killing grounds. Within fighter units, morale collapsed. Pilots who had once flown with swagger now faced overwhelming odds. The psychological transformation that began with disbelief turned into a grim acceptance. The Allies had achieved not only numerical superiority but qualitative dominance. The Mustang, once a rumor, now defined every engagement. Oberleutnant Friedrich Geischardt, a 30-victory ace flying with Jagdgeschwader 11, wrote in his diary that summer, "They are everywhere. We dive, they dive. We climb, they climb higher. Even our radios crackle with their voices. It is as if the Americans have found a way to make their machines tireless." What he did not know was that the Mustang's long range allowed pilots to loiter for hours over German airspace, ambushing returning fighters as they landed. The old rule that a pilot was safe once over his own airfield no longer applied. By June 1944, Luftwaffe intelligence officers compiled reports from across Western Germany, summarizing the new reality. The enemy, single-seater, type P-51B, C, now operates without restriction throughout the Reich. No German fighter can equal its altitude performance or endurance. Loss ratios unfavorable in all engagements. The Germans had captured one Mustang. The Allies had built more than 10,000. The Rechlin engineers tried to learn from what they saw. They studied the Mustang's cooling system, its famous belly-mounted radiator with a Meredith effect duct that converted heat into thrust. German designers had long dismissed such a system as impractical. Now they saw that, properly executed, it not only cooled efficiently but actually added speed. They analyzed the fuselage structure, semi-monocoque, lightweight, and stress-efficient. They dissected the fuel system, discovering self-sealing tanks with venting, mechanisms superior to their own. Every element reflected an attention to maintenance and reproducibility, the hallmarks of industrial design. One engineer, Dr. Ing, Helmut Schelp, who oversaw fighter propulsion programs, remarked privately that the Mustang embodied a philosophy alien to our industry. Where Germany pursued technological perfection through complexity, the Americans pursued reliability through simplicity. That difference, more than horsepower or altitude, defined the outcome of the air war. In a classified report dated May 22, 1944, the Air Ministry summarized the Rechlin findings for the Reichsmarschall, Hermann Göring. Enemy fighter P-51 exhibits performance superior to Bf-1, O-9G and FW-190A at all altitudes. Engine production methods indicate industrial standardization beyond current German capability. Recommendation: concentrate on jet development, piston competition no longer viable. It was, in essence, an prode, admission of defeat in the world of propeller-driven flight. Goering's handwritten comment, preserved in the surviving copy, reads, "If our factories cannot match this, then we must leap ahead by other means." That other means was the jet. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, would indeed represent a leap forward in speed. But it arrived too late, and in too few numbers, to alter the course of the war. Meanwhile, the captured Mustang continued to fly test sorties at Rechlin until autumn. Pilots used it to compare against late-war prototypes, the FOF U-190D Dora, the TAR-152H, and even a prototype Me 209 high-speed interceptor. None matched its blend of handling and endurance. In September 1944, Reich flew the Mustang side by side with a Focke-Wulf Dora equipped with the Junkers Jumo 213 engine. The Dora could briefly match its speed at low altitude, but lost power above 20,000 feet. After the flight, Reich remarked to observers, "The Focke-Wulf has the muscles, the Mustang has the lungs." The phrase circulated quietly among the engineers, half joke, half epitaph. By late 1944, the consequences of the Mustang's superiority were visible across every German airfield. Hangars stood half empty. Replacement pilots arrived with barely 100 flight hours. Aviation fuel, diverted to the armoured divisions fighting in France, was rationed to the point that training flights were cancelled. The Luftwaffe, once a force of innovation, had become reactive. Each new Allied technology forced a desperate countermeasure. Radar jamming begat counterjamming. Long-range escort brought futile attempts to field point defense jets. Even propaganda could not conceal the imbalance. In November, American P-51s of the 8th Air Force flew unopposed over Berlin. Civilians looked up and saw silver fighters circling in the clear winter sky. The same city that had once celebrated the Blitzkrieg now watched foreign aircraft fly victory loops above the Brandenburg Gate. At Rechlin, the captured Mustang still stood in its hangar, its American stars overpainted but faintly visible beneath the German crosses. Engineers continued to take measurements, to photograph every fitting, to hope that somehow, if they studied long enough, they might extract a secret that would restore balance. But there was no secret left to find. The truth was already written in aluminum and rivets. When American forces captured Rechlin in April 1945, they found the Mustang still intact, though grounded by lack of fuel. Its logbooks, neatly written in German script, documented every test flight and every observation. The final entry, dated January 10, 1945, read simply, "Aircraft in storage. Fuel unavailable. Engine excellent. No defects." After the war, Allied intelligence officers reviewing captured documents were astonished by the depth of the German analysis. The Rechlin reports read almost like tributes. One American officer wrote in his assessment, "The Germans understood the Mustang perfectly and despaired because of it." Indeed, several of the engineers who had tested the aircraft later worked with Allied aviation authorities in the post-war years. Dr. Beerbohm joined the French Aeronautical Research Programme. Reich himself became a test pilot for the British Air Ministry, where he flew captured Me 262s and Allied aircraft side by side. In his post-war reflections, he returned often to the captured Mustang of 1944. It was not just the machine that impressed us, it was the system behind it. The Americans built thousands of aircraft as perfect as the one we tested. We could build perfection once, but not again and again. That was the difference. His words capture the deeper irony of the story. The Luftwaffe's elite pilots had once believed that the mastery of the air would belong to those with the finest machines and the bravest men. The war revealed another truth, that victory would belong to those who could fuse engineering with industry, precision with repetition, genius with mass production. By 1945, as Allied air supremacy crushed the last remnants of the Luftwaffe, fragments of that captured Mustang still lay at Rechlin. When Soviet troops overran the base in May, they seized the aircraft as a war prize and shipped it east. Some sources claim it was later tested at the Soviet Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute in Moscow before being scrapped. Others say its engine was used to study Western fuel additives. Whatever its ultimate fate, the aircraft's legacy endured in memory and in the quiet, humbling lessons it left behind. The Germans had captured a P-51 Mustang and in doing so, captured a mirror of their own downfall. For in its polished aluminum, they saw the reflection of an industrial world they could no longer command. A future they had once imagined would be theirs. What began as an act of technical curiosity ended as a moment of reckoning. The men who examined the Mustang did not merely study a machine. They confronted a civilization built upon a new principle, that precision and quantity could coexist, that craftsmanship could scale, that power could be standardized. In that revelation lay the true defeat, not of wings or engines, but of belief. When the war ended, Europe lay silent beneath the ash of its own ambitions. Cities once filled with the hum of factories and the echo of marching boots now whispered only through broken glass. But among the ruins, a few stories still moved quietly between men who had once served the Reich engineers, pilots, mechanics, all haunted by the same memory. The captured silver fighter at Rechlin. For those who had seen it, the P-51 Mustang became something larger than a machine. It was a question one that lingered long, after the shooting stopped. How could a nation that had once led the world in aviation fall so far behind so quickly? In the months following Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence officers gathered the remnants of the Reich's research programs. The British called it Operation Surgeon. The Americans, Operation Lusty. Both had the same goal, to capture German aeronautical knowledge before the Soviets could. They found shelves stacked with reports, thousands of pages of test data, engine charts, aerodynamic coefficients, but among the technical diagrams and bureaucratic memoranda, one document stood out. It was the full Rechlin evaluation of the captured Mustang, stamped Geheime Kommandosache top secret command matter. Inside were the words of Hans Werner Lersch, carefully preserved. This aircraft demonstrates the perfect balance of aerodynamics, performance, and pilot comfort. The P-51 is a pilot's aircraft. Every element, control, harmony, visibility, range, has been designed with the flyer in mind. It is the culmination of practical experience and disciplined engineering. To the Allied officers reading those lines in 1945, it was almost surreal. The most thorough praise for an American fighter had come from Germany's own testing command. In London, British engineers studying the same report added their own note. The German evaluation of the Mustang reveals something they did not intend: an admiration for efficiency they could not replicate. Their pride was their undoing. After the war, many of the men who had worked at Rechlin found themselves scattered across the defeated nation. Some took ordinary jobs, blending into the anonymity of the ruins. Others were quietly recruited into foreign programs. The United States, France, even the Soviet Union, each hungry to exploit the intellectual capital of the Reich. Hans Werner Lersch, the test pilot who had flown the captured Mustang, was among the few permitted to resume flying. Under British supervision, he tested captured Me 262 seconds, Arado 234 jet bombers, and a range of Allied aircraft. Years later, when asked by a British officer which plane had impressed him most, he did not hesitate. "The Mustang," he said. It was the one machine that needed no excuses. For Lersch and others like him, the war had stripped away illusions. The Luftwaffe's technical culture, brilliant, inventive, but fragmented, had collided with a system that turned invention into production on an industrial scale. In Germany, engineers often spoke of Ideallösungen, the ideal solution, the perfect design, refined through endless iteration. In America, engineers spoke of production tolerance, the acceptable range that allowed thousands of workers to build the same part on different assembly lines. That difference, more than any single design choice, decided the future of aviation. When the Cold War began, the lessons of the Mustang echoed in every major air power on Earth. In the United States, the aircraft became a symbol of industrial democracy, proof that a well-designed, mass-produced fighter could defeat even the most elite enemy. Its principles, high efficiency, long range, modular construction, influenced everything from the F-86 Sabre to the early jet bombers of Strategic Air Command. In Britain, engineers at Hawker and de Havilland studied the Mustang's laminar flow wing, applying similar ideas to the Hawker Sea Fury and the first jet fighters. In the Soviet Union, captured German engineers and technical reports were quietly distributed through TAGI, the Central Aerodynamic Institute. There, the Mustang's performance curves were compared with those of the La-9 and Yak-3. Soviet designers admitted, privately, that their piston-engine aircraft had never achieved the same efficiency. And in the new West German Republic, where aviation was banned until 1955, young engineers studied the story of the Rechlin, Mustang, as a parable. It was taught not as humiliation, but as insight. The new generation learned that innovation without system was vanity, and that discipline could achieve what genius alone could not. In the United States, the Mustang's story did not end in 1945. It served again in Korea, strafing columns along the Yalu River. It flew with the air forces of Sweden, Israel, and even Germany this time under NATO command. When the newly formed Bundesluftwaffe received its first post-war fighters in the 1952nd, many of its pilots had once worn the Iron Cross. Some had been at Rechlin. They remembered the captured Mustang, and now they flew the descendants of that very aircraft, powered by jet engines, built by the same industrial system they had once underestimated. History had completed its turn. In 1961, a retired German engineer named Dr. Otto Baerbohm, once a senior figure at Rechlin, was invited to speak at an aerodynamics symposium in Paris. His lecture was quiet, academic, almost hesitant. But at the end, during the discussion, someone asked him about the war, about the Mustang. Baerbohm paused. Then he said, "When we tested the American P-51, we believed we were studying a machine. We were mistaken. We were studying a civilization." He explained that the aircraft's excellence could not be isolated to its design. It was the product of education systems, factory organization, logistics, fuel chemistry, and even the psychology of its pilots. The Mustang, he said, embodied a nation's method of thinking. We Germans sought perfection. The Americans built consistency. We crafted the extraordinary. They engineered the reliable. In war, the reliable wins. Those words, recorded in the proceedings, became one of the most cited reflections in post-war aeronautical history. They marked not just the end of a rivalry, but the reconciliation of two visions of progress. In 1978, the Deutsches Museum in Munich acquired a restored P-51D Mustang, painted not in the bright silver of wartime, but in neutral grey. On its information plaque, a single line acknowledged the story. One aircraft of this type was tested at Rechlin in 1944. German pilots considered it the finest piston-engine fighter ever built. Visitors walked past it every day, school children, veterans, tourists, rarely realizing that the machine before them had once carried the weight of a nation's disbelief. But those who knew, knew. They saw in its smooth lines not just the power of engineering, but the humility that comes from understanding one's limits. The same aerodynamic grace that once symbolized domination had become, over time, a lesson in respect. By the late 20th century, aviation had moved far beyond the propeller age. Jets roared where once pistons hummed. Computers guided aircraft that no human hands could have balanced alone. Yet within test pilot circles from Edwards Air Force Base to the research facilities at Göttingen, the name Mustang still carried a kind of reverence. It was not merely nostalgia, it was recognition. Recognition that, in 1944, a single captured fighter had forced one of the most technologically advanced nations on Earth to admit a truth that transcended war. That progress is not just invention, but replication. That excellence is not achieved in isolation, but through system. And that sometimes, understanding your enemy means seeing not what he builds, but how he builds it. After the war, A German officer who had reviewed the Rechlin tests was asked by an American historian whether he ever felt bitterness about the outcome. The officer smiled faintly and said, "No, we had the Me-262. We thought that made us gods. But when I first sat in the cockpit of the Mustang, I realized we had been building miracles. They had been building the future." He looked away then, as if the words had released something he'd carried for decades. We never built anything that fast, not because we lacked the knowledge, but because we lacked the patience to make it ordinary. That sentence became the quiet epilogue of an extraordinary story, the moment when pride yielded to understanding. And so, the legend of the captured Mustang endures not just as a tale of technological triumph, but as a mirror held up to the 20th century itself. In its polished fuselage gleamed both the brilliance of invention and the humility of civilization. The Germans captured a P-51 Mustang, and in doing so, they discovered that true power lies not in speed, or altitude, or firepower, but in the ability to build greatness, again and again, until it becomes normal. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.